What would you do if you discovered the truth about a loved one you thought you knew? A truth so shocking, it shatters everything you believed. What happens when a trusted leader, a pillar of the community, hides a terrible secret? And what does it mean for those who believed in him, his family, his congregation, and his faith? This is the story of a mother pushed to the edge, a daughter seeking justice, and a church forced to confront the unthinkable. What happens when a family's foundation isn't what it seems? What happens when the one place that should feel safest becomes a place of fear? In the Walters household, the answers to these questions were buried deep, hidden in silence and wrapped in secrets. They say faith is unshakable, that love endures all. But what happens when faith collides with betrayal? When love becomes a shield for something much darker? For Grace Walters, her journey was just beginning. Welcome to True Crime IQ. Thank you, my viewers. Thank you for joining me as we unravel the chilling stories that keep us questioning the limits of trust, love, and betrayal. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest gripping tales. Stay tuned, because this is a case you won't forget. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking truth and the devastating aftermath that shook a community to its core. In the heart of Atlanta, among rows of manicured lawns and tidy homes, stood a towering church, its steeple rising proudly against the southern sky. This was not just any church. It was a beacon for the community, a place where families gathered every Sunday, hands clasped in prayer, seeking solace and inspiration. At the center of it all was Pastor Jeremiah Walters. To those who filled the pews each week, Jeremiah was a man of integrity and wisdom. His sermons stirred hearts, his voice commanding and soothing all at once. People would leave the service with a renewed sense of faith, inspired by the man they called their shepherd. But amidst the sea of adoring faces, there was one that stood apart, Grace Walters, Jeremiah's 13-year-old daughter. Grace sat quietly, her frame smaller than her peers, her movements deliberate, marked by the effects of cerebral palsy. Her hands rested on her lap, her gaze fixed on her father as he preached. To the congregation, she looked like a devoted child admiring her father. But in the briefest moments, when no one was watching, there was something else in her eyes. A flicker of something unspoken. And then, there was Linda Walters, Jeremiah's wife. Linda wasn't just a pastor's wife. She was the church's backbone. She managed events, organized meals, and greeted every visitor with a warm smile. To many, Linda and Jeremiah were the epitome of a perfect family, living a life others could only admire. Linda saw herself as her husband's biggest supporter, the anchor behind his calling. She loved him deeply, believed in his mission, and trusted him completely. The Walters family seemed flawless. Grace, the quiet daughter. Linda, the dutiful wife. Jeremiah, the revered leader. But as with any family, there were things unseen, words unspoken, truths hidden. And when cracks began to appear, they started small, almost invisible. It's in those cracks, though, that the light of truth eventually shines through. Behind the walls of their seemingly perfect home, the Walters family lived a life that many envied. To outsiders, their house was warm and inviting, a reflection of their unity and faith. But inside, where no one could see, Grace Walters endured a reality far different from what the world imagined. One night, after the evening prayers had been said and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Pastor Jeremiah called Grace into his study. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the overhead fan barely masking the tension in the air. He sat behind his desk, the weight of his authority filling the space around him. "Close the door," he said, his voice steady yet carrying an edge that made Grace hesitate. As she stepped inside, her hands clutched the fabric of her dress, her gaze fixed on the floor. She knew this was not a moment to resist. "You must understand," he began. "Discipline is an act of love. It is my duty to guide you on the right path." His words were laced with an unnerving calmness, but Grace's heart raced. She nodded silently, her small frame tense, her breathing shallow. The study, once a space of comfort where stories of scripture had been shared, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her as he continued to speak, weaving scripture into his reasoning, making it sound righteous. Grace wanted to speak, to question, but the fear held her tongue. She sat still, listening, enduring, as he dictated the rules of their home and her place within it. When it was over, Grace returned to her room. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Her thoughts raced, her mind replaying his words over and over. She wondered if it was her fault. Had she done something wrong? Could she make it stop? Sleep didn't come easily that night. The silence of the house felt heavy, and for Grace, it was a silence filled with doubt and fear. The next morning, as sunlight streamed into the kitchen and Linda bustled about preparing breakfast, Grace decided to confide in her mother. She couldn't hold it in any longer. Her mother, who hummed softly while flipping pancakes, seemed so sure of the world around her. Grace wanted to believe she could tell her that her mother would understand. "Mom," Grace began hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the sizzle of the stove. Linda turned, her smile warm and inviting. "What is it, honey?" she asked, setting the spatula down and giving Grace her full attention. Grace hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. How could she find the words to explain what she'd been feeling, what she'd experienced? After a moment, Grace took a deep breath. "It's about Dad," she said, her voice trembling. Linda's smile faltered slightly, confusion crossing her face. "What about your dad?" she asked, her tone still gentle but edged with curiosity. Grace's chest tightened, but she pushed forward, recounting the events of the previous night in as much detail as she could manage. Her voice wavered, her hands shaking as she spoke. When she finished, Linda stared at her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she shook her head. "Grace," she said firmly, "you must have misunderstood. Your father loves you. He would never do anything to hurt you." Grace's heart sank. She wanted to protest, to insist, but the certainty in her mother's voice silenced her. Linda turned back to the stove, dismissing the conversation as though it had never happened. Grace sat at the table, her appetite gone. Her mother's rejection of her words stung more deeply than she could have anticipated. She had hoped for understanding, for protection, but instead, she felt more alone than ever. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. As the day went on, Grace's mind replayed her mother's reaction. Was she wrong to speak up? Would anyone ever believe her? The weight of her silence grew heavier, pressing down on her with each passing moment. She avoided her father's gaze, her heart sinking further into despair. What happens when the truth is ignored? When the very people you trust to shield you turn away? Grace didn't have those answers yet, but she knew one thing. Her voice had gone unheard, and the silence threatened to consume her. It was a bright Sunday morning, and the church was alive with the sound of children laughing and playing. Inside one of the classrooms, Ms. Rebecca Carter was setting up for the children's program. Her warmth and patience made her a favorite among the kids, but today, her eyes kept drifting toward Grace Walters, who sat quietly in the corner, far removed from the cheerful chatter around her. Rebecca had noticed Grace's withdrawn demeanor before, but today, something about the way the young girl held herself seemed different. Her shoulders were hunched, her gaze fixed on the floor, and there was a heaviness in her presence that Rebecca couldn't ignore. After the program concluded and the other children had rushed out to join their parents, Rebecca gently approached Grace, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "Grace," she said softly, her voice careful not to startle, "is everything okay?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Grace looked up briefly, her eyes wide with hesitation, before quickly looking away. She shifted in her seat, clutching the edge of her chair as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Rebecca waited, giving Grace the space to speak, her patience an unspoken reassurance that there was no rush. After what felt like an eternity, Grace finally whispered, "Can I tell you something?" Her voice was barely audible, trembling with fear and uncertainty. Rebecca nodded, her expression unwavering. "Of course, Grace. You can tell me anything." Grace hesitated again, glancing toward the door to make sure they were alone. Then, with great effort, she began to speak. Her words came slowly, haltingly, each one carrying the weight of her fear and pain. As Grace recounted her experiences, Rebecca's heart ached. The words were spare, but the meaning was clear. Grace spoke of moments that should never exist in a child's life, of a father who demanded silence and a home that felt anything but safe. Rebecca's expression shifted from sadness to determination as she listened, her hands gripping the edge of the chair to steady herself. She knew this was more than a moment of confession. This was a cry for help. "Grace," Rebecca said firmly but kindly, "what you've told me is very important, and it's not something you should have to face alone. I'm going to help you." Grace's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe Rebecca, But the years of silence had taught her to be cautious. What if he finds out? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. You're not alone in this, Grace. I promise. Later that afternoon, Rebecca made the difficult decision to approach Linda Walters. She found her in the church office, diligently organizing the week's schedules. Linda greeted Rebecca with her usual cordial smile, but it quickly faded when Rebecca explained why she was there. As Rebecca spoke, Linda's face hardened, her initial confusion giving way to anger. Are you accusing my husband of something? Linda demanded, her voice sharp. Rebecca remained calm, though her heart raced. I'm not accusing anyone, Linda, she replied. But Grace is clearly distressed, and she needs support. I thought you'd want to know. Linda's response was swift and defensive. Grace is a child. Children exaggerate. She probably misunderstood something. Rebecca was taken aback, but pressed on. Linda, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe what she told me. This isn't something we can ignore. But Linda wouldn't hear it. Her voice rose as she defended Jeremiah, accusing Rebecca of trying to create division in the church. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Linda snapped. Jeremiah has given his life to this community. He's a good man, and I won't let you tarnish his reputation over some story. Rebecca felt the weight of Linda's words, but she couldn't shake the image of Grace sitting alone in that classroom, her eyes pleading for help. This isn't about reputation, Linda, Rebecca said, her voice steady but firm. This is about Grace. She's your daughter. She needs you to listen. But Linda had already made up her mind. I think it's best if Grace doesn't attend your program anymore, she said coldly, turning back to her work. Rebecca's heart sank, but she knew she couldn't give up. As she left the office, Rebecca felt a surge of frustration and resolve. Grace needed protection, and if Linda wouldn't step up, Rebecca would have to find another way. But time was slipping away, and the question remained. How much longer could Grace endure this before it was too late? For Linda Walters, life had always followed a carefully scripted path. She was the dutiful wife, the dependable mother, and the steady pillar of their close-knit church. Her world revolved around the man she married, the pastor she believed was anointed to lead and protect. But the cracks that had begun to form were growing impossible to ignore. Linda had always prided herself on knowing her family, on understanding their needs without them having to say a word. But lately, Grace was becoming a mystery to her. The once bubbly child who used to light up at the smallest gestures now avoided eye contact. She flinched when Jeremiah reached out to pat her shoulder during dinner and retreated into silence during moments that once would have been filled with laughter. Linda noticed, but she told herself it was just a phase. Children go through phases, don't they? It wasn't until one quiet evening, she had just come back from organizing a women's program in church. It was more of a meet and greet to get more acquainted with the sisters in the church. When she left the house, her husband, Pastor Jeremiah Walters, was at home with their daughter, Grace. He had murmured something about wanting to help her with her assignment. But as she walked into the house, something felt off. She couldn't name it, but something was wrong. Immediately, she called out her husband's name, but there was silence. She called Grace's name, but she heard no response. Her daughter was probably sleeping, but as she walked over to the kitchen, she heard the unmistakable sobs of a child. She was tensed. What was going on? She thought. She walked to her daughter's room, and her daughter Grace was lying on her bed. She had cried herself to sleep. Her journal, where she wrote her daily musings, was just beside her. She hesitated. It felt wrong to pry, but the nagging sense that she was missing something far more important won out. She picked up the journal, her fingers trembling as she opened the first page. What she read in the faint light of Grace's bedside lamp would change her forever. Each entry was written in Grace's uneven handwriting, and at first glance, it seemed ordinary. Daily musings, thoughts about school, mentions of church events. But as Linda turned the pages, the words grew heavier. Grace had written about feeling afraid, about the things her father said to her, and things he did to her when no one else was around. She described nights when the house was quiet, and she was summoned to his study. Her words, though careful, painted a vivid picture of manipulation, fear, and pain. Linda's breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She read until the end, unable to stop, unable to look away. By the time she closed the journal, her hands were shaking, and tears streamed down her face. The man she had dedicated her life to, the man she had defended, was not the man she thought he was. She felt her heart break into pieces, each one sharper than the last. But with the shattering of her trust came something else, something far more powerful: anger. Jeremiah came home late that night, his usual confident demeanor unshaken as he stepped through the door. But Linda was waiting for him. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and in her hands, she clutched the journal like it was a lifeline. As he walked into the kitchen, she stood, her voice trembling with rage and sorrow. "How could you?" she demanded, her words slicing through the air. "How could you do this to her?" Jeremiah froze, his expression hardening as he took in the sight of the journal. He let out a low chuckle, one that sent a chill down Linda's spine. "You've been reading Grace's little fantasies, I see," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "You believe her? Over me?" Linda's voice rose, her desperation spilling out with every word. "She's a child, our only child, and she's terrified of you. What kind of father does that? What kind of man?" Her words caught in her throat as Jeremiah stepped closer, his face twisting into something she barely recognized. "You're overreacting," he said coldly. "You always have. This is why you don't understand how to handle things. I should have listened to her when she tried to tell me, but I didn't. I believed you, and you betrayed that trust," she said with a shattered heart. The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the empty house. Linda demanded answers, begged him to admit what he'd done. But Jeremiah refused, his dismissive laughter only fueling her fury. And then he said something that made the world tilt on its axis. "You and your daughter are nothing without me, Linda. Nothing. You'd both be lost if it weren't for me." In that moment, something inside Linda snapped. The rage, the grief, the years of silence she'd endured. They all converged into a single, blinding instant of clarity. Her hand moved before she could think, reaching for the kitchen knife on the counter. The blade glinted under the harsh fluorescent light as she raised it, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Stop," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But Jeremiah didn't stop. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, his arrogance unshaken. And then, in one swift motion, Linda acted. The knife came down, and the room fell silent. For a long moment, she stood there, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. Jeremiah lay motionless, the man who had once commanded the admiration of so many now still and silent. The reality of what she'd done began to sink in, heavy and unrelenting. Linda sank to her knees, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them clear. All she knew was that the man she had loved was gone, and she had been the one to end it. In the heavy silence that followed, Linda stood at the edge of everything she had ever known. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest like a stone, unyielding and cold. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone. She could feel the tremors in her body, but there was no turning back. She had done what she had to do, what she thought was right. Or had she? The operator's voice on the other end of the line seemed distant, like the words belonged to someone else. 911. "What's your emergency?" Linda's response was simple, but each word felt like a final reckoning. "I killed my husband." The confession seemed to hang in the air, as if the truth itself had weight. She felt no relief, only a deeper sense of finality. The decision was made, and there would be no going back. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights illuminating the darkened house. Linda didn't resist. She didn't try to explain further, didn't try to justify herself. She simply waited as they took her into custody. But it was Grace, standing just behind the doorway, who was the real concern now. The police, with their professionalism and cold detachment, immediately turned their attention to the child. She was whisked away in an instant, her small form enveloped in a blanket, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She didn't understand what was happening, not really. She only knew that her father was gone and her mother was being taken away. Linda was led away in handcuffs, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. She had wanted to protect her daughter. She had thought that this would be the end of it. Grace was placed in protective custody, her future uncertain, her life fractured into pieces she could never have imagined. It was Rebecca who became the lifeline. In the wake of the chaos, Rebecca Carter, the Sunday school teacher who had always seen Grace as more than just the quiet, withdrawn child, stepped in. Rebecca was steady, her presence unwavering as she took on the responsibility of looking after Grace. For the first time in a long time, Grace began to trust again. Rebecca didn't pressure her, didn't push her to speak before she was ready. She simply listened when Grace chose to talk. She guided her through the darkest days, becoming the mother figure Grace had needed all along, even when she hadn't known it. There were moments, fleeting and precious, when Grace would smile. Small, hesitant smiles that spoke volumes of the healing that was beginning, even if Grace didn't fully understand it yet. For Linda, her trial loomed on the horizon, and with it came the weight of the questions she could never answer. Would she be forgiven? Could there ever be a path to redemption for someone who had made such an irreversible choice? And most haunting of all, would Grace ever truly understand why her mother had done it? In the courtroom, Linda stood at the front of it all, a woman who had once been the pillar of her family, now reduced to a trembling figure in the cold, sterile space. The gavel fell, and the room went quiet. Linda took a deep breath as she addressed the court, her voice breaking with emotion, the years of guilt and sorrow spilling out. "I never wanted this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted any of this. But when I saw what was happening to my daughter, I knew I had to do something. I had to protect her. I thought if I didn't, we would both be lost." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the raw truth of a mother's broken heart. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was simply speaking the only truth she had left. "I'm guilty," she said, her voice steady now. "I know what I did. And I will live with that for the rest of my life." The courtroom was packed, a quiet hum filling the air as the final moments of Linda Walters' trial approached. Each person present had a different perspective on what had unfolded, and yet there was one undeniable truth that stood at the center of it all. A mother had killed her husband. But why? And could anyone truly understand the complexity of the decision she had made? When her defending lawyer spoke, he talked about the love Linda has for Grace, and that she acted out of her maternal instinct to protect her daughter. That Linda was driven to the edge of her own endurance. She saw the terror in her daughter's eyes, a mother who, in the darkness of her own home, witnessed the unbearable weight of her child's suffering. Despite the argument of her attorney, Linda was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 5 years. As the final echoes of the trial faded, Linda was led away, her hands shackled but her heart still clinging to the hope that someday, perhaps, she could be forgiven. She glanced back at Grace one last time, her daughter's face a mixture of sorrow and resilience. The love between them was still there, undeniable and fierce, but the road ahead would be anything but easy. For now, though, Linda could take solace in one thing. Her daughter was safe. And in a world where so much had been shattered, that was a small victory worth holding on to. As we come to the end of this story, what was your reaction to the final verdict in this case? Do you think Linda's actions were justified? Do you believe that the justice system can ever truly understand the complexities of a mother's love and protection? And how do you think Grace will cope with the aftermath of everything she's been through? We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this intense, emotional case. Share your perspective in the comments below. Let's get the conversation started. Don't forget to like this video if you found it thought-provoking, and subscribe to True Crime IQ for more gripping tales like this. Join the community, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and we'll see you in our next video.